And so, quite frankly, it wasn't anything I wasn't used to. I had been locked up in juvenile several times. Everybody around me in the housing projects I grew up in were in and out of jail, in and out of juvenile, in and out of prison.
To millions of American viewers, Greg Mathis is a judge, a television star, and a symbol of redemption. From a teenager once pulled into gang life, he rose to become one of the most respected public figures in America. But is the story the public has known for more than 20 years really the whole truth? When Linda Mathis, the wife who had stood beside him for nearly 4 decades, suddenly filed for divorce, rumors of infidelity, marital secrets, and hidden corners of his private life erupted all at once. At the same time, his son's decision to make a shocking announcement on television placed the Mathis family under more scrutiny than ever before. Behind those explosive headlines, however, were details that received far less attention. There were also pieces of evidence, admissions, and decisions made behind the closed doors of the Mathis household that most of the public had never heard in full. Did this marriage truly collapse because of one devastating secret, or were crucial details inflated by the tabloid press? And behind Linda's decision to seek a divorce, was there betrayal, years of accumulated pain, or an entirely different truth that had never been made public? For more than 2 decades, Greg Mathis appeared before millions of American viewers from a position that seemed almost untouchable. He sat above the courtroom, listened to arguments, pulled testimony apart, identified mistakes, and delivered judgments. On television, Greg was more than a judge. He was also a man who repeatedly spoke about responsibility, honesty, and the price every person must pay for the choices they make. That image gradually became a familiar part of American popular culture. A man who had once stood on the other side of the law now represented it. A former teenage gang member had become a voice for discipline and second chances. Then life placed Greg in an entirely different position. This time, he was not the man behind the bench. He was the man being brought before the court of public opinion. It began when Linda Mathis, Greg's wife of nearly 40 years, unexpectedly filed for divorce. To many people, this was not simply a legal proceeding between 2 spouses. It looked like a sudden fracture running through a wall the public had always believed was solid. For years, Greg and Linda had been seen as a couple who survived poverty, scandal, success, and the pressures of fame together. Their marriage seemed like living proof that the past did not have to prevent a family from building a future. So when Linda chose to end the relationship, one question surfaced immediately. What had happened behind those closed doors? The media rushed to fill the silence with rumor. Stories of infidelity appeared everywhere. Some reports raised the possibility that Greg had fathered a child outside the marriage. Old disputes, forgotten allegations, and vague fragments from his private life were dug up and arranged beside one another like evidence in a case that had never reached a verdict. The more information appeared, the more mercilessly Greg's image was placed under the light. The man who had demanded honesty from others on television was now being questioned about honesty inside his own marriage. The man who often spoke about consequences was now being forced to confront consequences that may have grown from his own decisions. Every headline seemed to arrive with a verdict already attached. Hypocrite. Unfaithful husband. A public symbol built on an image of perfection while hiding an entirely different life behind the cameras. Yet, in the middle of the speculation, Greg did not remain completely silent. He admitted that he had been unfaithful. It was an admission powerful enough to intensify the controversy. To part of the public, it looked like confirmation of their darkest suspicions. But Greg also denied several other rumors circulating around him, including allegations he said did not reflect the truth. The problem was that once the door had opened, it became difficult to separate what had been confirmed from what had merely been constructed out of missing information. The public no longer saw an ordinary marriage in crisis. They saw a scandal. The press was no longer telling the story of two people who had shared almost 4 decades together. It was telling the story of a symbol collapsing in public. But marriages rarely fall apart because of a single moment. Behind a divorce filing, there are often years of silence, disagreement, pain, and unresolved conflict. One confession may shake the entire structure, but it does not necessarily explain everything that happened inside it. Greg and Linda had spent almost 40 years together. That was enough time to contain loyalty and disappointment, forgiveness, and wounds that may never have fully disappeared. After several weeks of separation, instead of moving immediately toward the end, they made a different decision. They entered marriage counseling together. At a moment when public opinion had nearly finished writing the ending, Greg and Linda returned to the problems inside their relationship. Not before the cameras, not through sensational interviews, but in a room where both of them had to confront whatever had brought their marriage to the edge. It may have been their final opportunity, but it also raised a larger question. If the Mathis family had long been presented as a model of success and stability, how could fractures this serious have remained hidden behind a flawless image for so many years? Before he became the man America was judging, Greg Mathis had lived on the other side of the law. In a world where prison drugs and violence were not television stories, but daily reality. Years before Greg Mathis entered a courtroom as a judge, he had stood before the law as a defendant. The story began in Detroit, in a poor neighborhood where violence was never far away. It was a place where children could hear police sirens before they fully understood what the law meant. Drugs, crime, and street confrontations existed as an almost ordinary part of life. Greg grew up inside that environment. His father left the family, leaving Greg's mother to raise 4 children alone. The burden was not only financial. A single mother had to protect her children from hunger from the streets and from dangerous choices waiting just beyond the front door. But sometimes the pressure of an environment is stronger than every warning. Greg was gradually drawn into gang life. For a teenager growing up in unstable neighborhoods, a gang could offer the illusion of belonging. It could make powerless children feel protected, respected, and important. The price of that belonging appeared quickly. Greg became involved in selling drugs. He participated in robberies. Encounters with the police grew more frequent. Arrest was no longer an unexpected disaster. It became a repeating part of the life of a teenager, sliding farther away from every ordinary opportunity. By the age of 17, the real consequences arrived. Greg was tried and sentenced to prison as an adult. At an age when many teenagers were still thinking about school, a first job, or uncertain plans for the future, Greg faced a sentence that could define the rest of his life. In the eyes of the justice system, he was no longer a lost child. He was an adult criminal. Ahead of him seemed to be nothing but steel doors, a criminal record, and a future growing narrower by the day. People who traveled the road Greg had taken were rarely given an easy path back. One prison sentence could lead to years of unemployment, repeat offenses, and permanent exclusion from society. Then, in that darkest period, something else happened. Greg's mother, who was battling cancer, came to visit him in prison. This was not a meeting between a healthy mother and a son waiting to return home. She arrived with a body being consumed by illness and with the pain of a woman who had raised 4 children alone, only to watch one of them disappear behind bars. What she said during that visit broke Greg down. She forced him to confront a reality he may never before have faced directly. The path he was following was not only destroying his own future, it was forcing a mother already fighting cancer to watch her son vanish into the prison system. Greg stood before a choice. He could continue believing that his life had already been written by a poor neighborhood, an absent father, and years inside a gang. He could accept prison as merely the first stop in a long cycle of failure, or he could attempt what seemed impossible: change. Not through an easy promise, not by declaring that he had become a different man and waiting for society to believe him. Greg would have to begin again with almost nothing except a criminal record and a determination that had only just awakened. The visit with his mother became the turning point. The teenager who had sold drugs, committed robbery, and followed the logic of the street decided that he would not allow the past to write the rest of his life. But choosing to change did not erase the consequences. When Greg left prison, society did not immediately open its doors. His record remained. People in authority often saw a criminal before they saw a human being trying to rebuild himself. And that was only the beginning. Redemption did not arrive like a miracle. Greg did not walk out of prison and instantly become a symbol. In front of him stood a system that did not easily forget the past, even when a person had made the decision to change. After prison, Greg Mathis began rebuilding his life from the most basic foundations. He earned his GED. To many people, that might have looked like a modest educational milestone. For Greg, it was the first piece of proof that he was truly moving in another direction. From there, he went to college and then to law school. The journey carried a remarkable contradiction. A man who had been arrested repeatedly and convicted at 17 now wanted to enter the very legal system that had punished him. Greg did not simply want to understand the law, he wanted to become part of it. But the past did not disappear because he studied hard. Each time Greg moved closer to the profession he had chosen, his criminal record appeared again like a locked door. He was repeatedly denied permission to practice law. For the people making those decisions, the question was not simply whether Greg had met the academic requirements. They had to decide whether a man with a criminal past deserved to be trusted with authority inside the legal profession. It was a confrontation between an individual's transformation and a system's unwillingness to forget. Greg insisted that he was no longer the 17-year-old boy in that file, but the paperwork still recorded everything he had done. Society may praise the idea of second chances in the abstract, but when the chance must be given to a real person with a real record, forgiveness often becomes cautious. Greg refused to surrender. He continued fighting to be recognized. Every rejection forced him to prove that redemption was not merely a story designed to move an audience. It could be measured in years of education, discipline, and refusal to return to the life he had escaped. The battle was about more than a license. It reached toward a larger question. Should a human being be defined forever by the worst mistake of his life? If society never allows people who have committed crimes to return, what meaning does rehabilitation actually have? If every door stays closed, is the system preventing another offense or quietly pushing people back toward the place they worked so hard to leave? Eventually, Greg was admitted to the profession. He entered the law and later became the youngest judge in Michigan. The transformation was almost unimaginable. The man who had once been sentenced now had the authority to sit on the bench. The man who had once listened to other people pronounce judgment now became the person delivering it. But Greg's distinction did not rest only on the drama of his biography. He understood the psychology of people who had lost their way in a manner many judges could not. When a teenager stood before him, Greg did not see only the offense. He could also see the poverty, lack of direction, anger, and abandonment that had once lived inside him. That experience helped him build the image of a judge who could be severe while still believing in the possibility of correction. Greg did not deny personal responsibility. He knew that every choice carried consequences, but he also believed punishment did not have to become the final sentence. A person could be required to pay for a mistake and still deserve the opportunity to begin again. That message quickly turned him into an inspirational figure. Greg's story contained every element the public wanted to believe in. A childhood shaped by poverty, a teenager who went astray, a sentence that seemed to close the future. Then, from that depth, a rise to the judge's bench. It was more than professional success. It looked like evidence that the past could be overcome. As his career developed, Greg gained what his younger self could scarcely have imagined: fame, respect, a prominent place in the community. And beside him stood a family the public regarded with admiration. After years of being judged by his criminal record, Greg had finally written another version of himself. But outward success does not guarantee inner peace. A man can defeat his past in the eyes of the law and still confront silent conflicts in private life. And as fame grows, family problems no longer belong only to the family. Greg had defeated the criminal record attached to his name. But a past written on paper can sometimes be easier to confront than the conflicts that survive behind the doors of a home. Greg Mathis entered a new stage of his career when he became a television star through the program Judge Mathis. The show ran for more than 2 decades, carrying his face and his story into millions of American homes. Before the camera, Greg was direct and sometimes hard, but he consistently tied his judgments to lessons about responsibility. Viewers were not simply watching him settle disputes. They were watching a former offender use his own past to tell others that mistakes do not erase consequences, but neither do they have to destroy the future. Outside the televised courtroom, the Mathis family became a crucial part of Greg's public image. He and Linda had spent nearly 40 years together. They had raised a successful family and appeared before the public as united and enduring. For many viewers, this completed Greg's story of redemption. He had not only escaped the streets, he had built a home. The family seemed to represent a happy ending. A man who had grown up without a father beside him had become a father to his own children. A teenager once consumed by gang life now stood at the center of a family others admired. But television lights always come with a price. The more famous a person becomes, the thinner the line between public life and private life grows. Personal decisions can become news. Family conflicts can be turned into national arguments. And anything that does not fit the polished image can immediately be treated as a crack in the foundation. The Mathis family first faced an extraordinary wave of attention when Greg Jr., Greg's son, publicly came out as gay. The announcement was made on television. It was not merely a private disclosure. Because Greg's family had become familiar to the public, Greg Jr.'s decision immediately pulled the entire household into a much wider conversation. Viewers began watching Greg's response. Given his image as a strict judge, a man formed by street culture, and a public figure who frequently spoke about morality, his attitude toward his son became a matter of particular scrutiny. Greg publicly stood beside Greg Jr. He offered support and defended his son against public pressure. The response earned widespread praise. To many people, Greg did not simply speak about family love. He proved it when his son needed him most. The image of the exemplary father grew even stronger. But precisely when the Mathis family was receiving this positive attention, the media also began digging more deeply into Greg's private life. The more perfect a family appears, the more curious the public becomes about whatever remains outside the frame. Questions began to surface. Was life behind the lights really the same as the life viewers saw? Was the bond between Greg and Linda truly as strong as the image built over so many years? Or had long-standing conflicts existed behind their public appearances, conflicts that had simply never been spoken aloud? Those questions may have remained speculation until Linda filed for divorce. To the public, the decision looked like a sudden reversal. The woman who had stood beside Greg from the years when he was rebuilding his life now wanted to leave a marriage that had lasted almost 4 decades. A family once used as a symbol of endurance was suddenly at the center of a crisis. From that moment forward, every image from the past was re-examined. Greg and Linda's public appearances, their statements about marriage, their family moments on television. Everything was placed under a microscope. Some believed the warning signs had been visible for years. Others argued that the media was overinterpreting ordinary details in order to manufacture a more compelling story. But when rumors of infidelity surfaced, and Greg admitted that he had once been unfaithful, the picture became more complicated. The image of the father who defended his son and the image of the husband who betrayed his wife existed inside the same man. One admirable act could not erase another wrong, but one wrong did not necessarily invalidate everything he had done correctly. Greg Mathis, the man who had spent years separating right from wrong before the public became proof that human beings rarely belong entirely to one side. He could be a father who supported his son. He could also be a husband who caused his wife pain. He could be a symbol of redemption. And at the same time, he could continue making mistakes after becoming that symbol. The model family viewers saw may not have been completely false, but neither was it the entire truth. Behind every family photograph are years the public never witnessed, private conversations, acts of forgiveness, hidden injuries, and limits understood only by the people living inside the marriage. When Linda filed for divorce, she was not merely stepping away from a marriage. She unintentionally pulled down the curtain, exposing part of a life the Mathis family had kept private for years. Yet the divorce filing was not the final period. Just as the press prepared to write the ending of the Mathis family, the two people at the center made a decision that changed the direction of the entire story. In the public imagination, a celebrity divorce usually follows a familiar script. The papers are filed. Anonymous sources appear. Both sides issue statements. The media divides the property, assigns responsibility, and distributes blame before the court has the opportunity to do any of it. But the story of Greg and Linda did not move directly toward that ending. After several weeks apart, they chose marriage counseling. It was not an easy decision, especially while their crisis was being watched by millions of people. Counseling could not erase what had happened. It could not turn an admission of infidelity into something that had never existed. But it forced both of them to do what the headlines could never do in their place. Talk about the cause, confront the pain, and decide whether nearly 40 years together still carried enough value for them to keep fighting. By April 2026, Greg and Linda had reconciled. That development turned the story in a direction entirely different from what had first been predicted. The marriage, widely described as finished, did not disappear beneath a series of public statements. They chose to remain and attempt to repair what had fractured. Reconciliation did not mean every problem was instantly solved. A marriage cannot return to its previous condition through a single decision. Once trust has been damaged, rebuilding requires time. Unanswered questions may remain. Painful memories do not vanish because a date changes on a legal document. But Greg and Linda's decision showed that they were not prepared to let almost 40 years together end in a few chaotic weeks. For Greg, the crisis carried a particular meaning. His entire life had been connected to the idea of a second chance. He built his career around the belief that a human being should not be permanently nailed to a mistake from the past. But speaking about second chances from a courtroom bench is one thing. Becoming the person who must ask for one inside his own family is something else entirely. As a young man, Greg had to prove to society that he was no longer the 17-year-old gang member who sold drugs and committed robbery. Decades later, he had to prove to Linda that his failures inside their marriage were not the whole of who he was, and that he was still capable of change. The two moments were separated by many years, but they placed the same question before him. Would he allow the mistake to dictate the ending, or would he do what was necessary to repair the damage? After the reconciliation, Greg continued his media work, podcasts, and programs supporting young people. He did not retreat from public life. Instead, he used his own crisis as a lesson. Not a lesson about perfection, but about the fact that even a man who built an entire career around responsibility could still fail in his private life. What matters is how that person responds once the failure is exposed. Greg acknowledged that his greatest success was not becoming a judge, nor was it appearing on television for more than 2 decades. Fame can disappear, a television program can end, a title can be replaced. But looking directly at a mistake, accepting its consequences, and attempting to repair it may be the harder test. It was an admission filled with contradiction. Greg had spent years telling other people to take responsibility for their choices. In the end, life forced him to live by the same principle when there was no judge's bench, no television script, and no safe distance between the person giving advice and the person who needed to hear it. From a boy caught in crime in the poor neighborhoods of Detroit, Greg Mathis became the youngest judge in Michigan. From a man once distrusted by the system, he became a television star known by millions. From a father praised for standing beside his son, he became a husband questioned for the mistakes he made inside his marriage. Those images do not cancel one another. They exist inside the same life. And perhaps that is the most difficult part of the Greg Mathis story to accept. Human beings do not always move in a straight line from wrongdoing to perfection. A person can overcome the past and still make new mistakes. He can inspire millions and still wound the people closest to him. Redemption is not a victory achieved once and preserved forever. It is a choice that must be made again and again. At 17, Greg chose to leave the path of crime. Decades later, he chose to confront the crisis in his marriage, rather than allow it to end in silence and bitterness. In both moments, he could not change what had already happened. He could only decide what he would do next. Greg Mathis's legacy, therefore, does not lie only in a famous television program or in the title of judge. It also lies in the tension between the public man and the private man, between the lessons he taught and the lessons life forced him to learn for himself. It is a story about responsibility, about forgiveness, about injuries that cannot be erased with an apology, and about the belief that a second chance matters only when the person receiving it is genuinely prepared to change. Greg and Linda's marriage did not collapse because of a single rumor, nor can it be fully explained by sensational headlines. Behind the crisis were real mistakes, years of pain, and a decision that was anything but easy to stay, to confront the damage, and to repair it. Greg Mathis spent an entire career telling others that the past was not a life sentence. In the end, life itself forced him to prove it.